What would drive a starving, dying bear to cling to life against all odds? When reclusive hunter Logan Wells stumbles upon a weakened grizzly deep in the frozen wilderness, he expects nature to take its course. But as he draws closer, he realizes she isn't just fighting for herself. She's guarding something shocking. What secret lies beneath the snow? And why does Logan feel compelled to save her? The truth will change everything. The wind cut through the valley like a sharpened blade, slicing between the jagged peaks of the Rockies. Logan Wells tightened the hood of his worn-out parka, his breath curling in the frozen air as he moved steadily through the snow-covered pines. His rifle hung loosely over his shoulder, but he wasn't hunting today, not in the way he once had. The days of tracking game for sport were long gone, replaced by the quiet necessity of survival. He preferred the solitude out here, away from the weight of memories he wasn't ready to lay down. The crisp silence of the wilderness was all he had left, a companion that neither judged nor consoled. As he approached the edge of a ridge, Logan stopped, his instincts prickling. Something was watching him. He didn't see it at first, just the endless white of snowdrift stretching toward the valley below. Then a shift of movement near a cluster of bare aspens caught his eye. The hulking figure stood motionless, its golden brown fur patchy and thin from the harsh season. A grizzly bear. It was larger than most he had encountered, but there was something off about her stance. Her head hung low, her breath visible in ragged bursts. Even from a distance, Logan could see the sharp protrusion of her ribs beneath her dull coat. His fingers twitched toward his rifle, an old instinct surfacing despite himself. A bear in this condition was dangerous. Starving animals were unpredictable, but she didn't charge, didn't even move beyond the subtle shifting of her massive paws in the snow. Logan stayed still, his heartbeat slow and measured, waiting for her to decide what she was going to do. Seconds stretched like hours. Then without a sound, the bear lowered herself onto her haunches and simply stared at him. Not in aggression, not in fear, just watching. Logan frowned. He had encountered plenty of bears before. Some had stalked his camp, some had torn through his stored food when he was careless, but none had ever behaved quite like this. It wasn't normal for a grizzly to sit and observe a human, especially one armed. A part of him told him to turn around, to ignore her presence and move on. She wasn't his problem, but another part, one he had tried to bury beneath layers of self-imposed solitude, held him in place. His gaze traveled over her once more, noting the dullness of her fur, the unnatural thinness of her frame. She should have been hibernating by now, deep in a den beneath the frost-laden earth. Yet here she was, lingering in the open, barely holding herself together. And then he saw it, the faint rounding of her belly, the heavy way she carried herself. She wasn't just starving, she was pregnant. Logan exhaled, his breath a plume of white in the cold air. That changed everything. A lone grizzly was one thing, but a mother. The odds of her surviving the remainder of winter in this condition were slim to none. The logical part of his mind reminded him that this was nature's way. The weak perished so the strong could thrive. He had lived by that rule for years, but for some reason, standing there beneath the shadow of the pines, he felt something shift in him. He reached into the small pack at his waist, fingers brushing against the bundle of dried venison he had planned to eat later. His muscles resisted the action. Food was scarce, and every piece mattered. Yet, against all reason, he pulled out a few strips and tossed them toward the bear. They landed in the snow with a soft thud. The bear didn't move at first. Her dark eyes flicked between him and the offering, suspicion lingering. Logan didn't make a sound, didn't take a step back or forward. He simply stood, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the grizzly shifted. Slowly, she lowered her massive head, her snout hovering just above the dried meat. Another pause. Then with surprising gentleness, she picked up the pieces and swallowed them whole. Logan didn't know why he felt relief at that. Maybe it was the way she ate, not ravenous or desperate, but with a quiet acceptance, as if she understood this was a kindness she hadn't expected. He shook his head at the thought. He was anthropomorphizing, something he had sworn he wouldn't do after too many years of getting attached to things that didn't last. Still, when she lifted her gaze to meet his again, there was something there. a silent understanding, a fragile truce. He took a cautious step back, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. The bear didn't follow. She merely watched, licking the last remnants of food from her jaws before settling deeper into the snow, as if exhausted from even this small exchange. Logan adjusted the strap of his rifle and turned away, forcing himself to move on. He told himself that was the end of it. He had done his part. Nature would take care of the rest. But as he made his way back toward his cabin, he couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. The way she had sat there, hollow-eyed and waiting. The way she had accepted his offering without demand or fear. That night, as he sat by his fire, the warmth licking at his skin, he thought of how the wind had howled through the trees where she lay. How alone she must have felt. And for the first time in a long while, Logan Wells found himself wondering if solitude was as much of a choice as he had always believed. The wind howled outside Logan's cabin, rattling the wooden shutters like an impatient guest demanding entry. Inside, the fire crackled, its embers glowing faintly in the dimly lit room. Logan sat at the edge of his cot, running a calloused hand over his face, willing himself to forget about the grizzly. It wasn't his business. Nature had its way of sorting things out, and he had long since stopped interfering in things he couldn't control. But the image of her lingered, the way she had looked at him, not with fear or aggression, but with something else, something he couldn't quite name. He had seen plenty of animals in distress before, had even come across starving wolves and scavenging cougars, but none had affected him quite like this. Maybe it was the way she had just sat there, resigned yet determined, as if she had already made peace with whatever fate awaited her. Maybe it was because she was carrying life within her, and something about that struck a chord he hadn't felt in years. Logan sighed and pushed himself up, pacing the small space of his cabin. He had enough food stored to last him through the winter if he rationed it carefully, but giving any more to the bear was reckless. And yet, even as he thought it, his hands were already gathering supplies. More dried venison, a few fish he had caught and smoked last week, a chunk of hard bread he had been saving. He stuffed them into a small cloth sack and slung it over his shoulder before he could talk himself out of it. Pulling on his heavy coat, he braced himself against the cold as he stepped outside. The night was bitter, the cold slicing through the trees like an invisible knife. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way back toward the ridge where he had last seen her. His breath formed ghostly clouds in the air, his heart beat steady but fast. He told himself this was a one-time thing, that he would leave the food and be done with it, that he wasn't getting involved. But as he drew closer to the clearing, something in his gut twisted. The spot where she had been sitting was empty. Fresh tracks in the snow told him she had moved, but they weren't meandering, weren't the casual wanderings of an animal searching for shelter. They were staggered, uneven, as if she had been struggling with every step. Logan followed them without thinking. His legs carried him forward even as his mind screamed at him to turn back, to let nature do what it always did. The tracks led him deeper into the trees, winding through the valley, past frozen streams and snow-laden branches. He found himself gripping the straps of his pack tighter, his breath coming harder with each step. Then finally he saw her. She lay at the base of a fallen tree, her massive body curled inward, her breaths shallow and ragged. Snow had begun to gather on her fur, clinging to her like a second skin. Logan approached slowly, cautiously, his instincts warring between fear and something else. Concern? He crouched a few feet away, watching, waiting. Her eyes flickered open at the sound of his boots crunching the ice. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she let out a low, exhausted huff and dropped her head back into the snow. Logan exhaled, running a hand through his beard. "You're making this real damn difficult," he muttered under his breath. He reached into the sack and pulled out the food, setting it down a few feet from her. She didn't move toward it, didn't even sniff the air. That was bad. If an animal was too weak to eat, it meant they were close to giving up. He knew that feeling well. He had felt it himself once, back when the grief had been too much, and the idea of facing another day had seemed unbearable. He rubbed his face and looked at the tree behind her. It wasn't much of a shelter, but it blocked the worst of the wind. He could do better. With a grunt, he stood and started clearing an area, gathering fallen branches, breaking them into smaller pieces. He worked in silence, his breath fogging the air, the steady rhythm of his movements the only sound besides the wind. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, only that he couldn't walk away. Not now. When he had built a makeshift windbreak, he took a step back and glanced at her. Her eyes were half-lidded, her body rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. He had seen animals fight to the last breath, and he had seen them surrender. She was teetering on that edge. "Come on," he said quietly, almost pleading. "Eat something." He nudged the venison closer with his boot, watching for any sign of interest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, painfully, she stretched her neck forward and sniffed the food. Logan held his breath as she took a tentative bite, chewing slowly before swallowing. Relief flooded through him, though he didn't show it. She ate a little more, then rested her head again, her body still trembling from exhaustion. Logan crouched down, wrapping his arms around his knees. He couldn't stay out here all night, but he also couldn't leave her like this. He glanced at the sky, noting the thickening clouds. More snow was coming. She needed real shelter. His cabin wasn't far. It was risky, bringing a bear that close, but something told him she wouldn't survive another night out here. He had no idea how he was going to get a full-grown grizzly to move, especially one this weak, but he had to try. He stood, tightening the straps of his coat. "All right, girl," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Let's get you somewhere safe." She didn't move. He wasn't even sure she had heard him. He stepped forward, carefully, watching for any sign of resistance. When she didn't react, he did something that every instinct in his body screamed against. He reached out and touched her. Her fur was coarse and tangled, matted with ice. She didn't flinch, didn't growl. She was too far gone for that. Logan swallowed and took a breath. He needed to be smart about this. He moved behind her, pressing his hands against her side. "Come on," he murmured. "I know you've got some fight left in you." He pushed gently at first, then with more force. At first, nothing. Then after what felt like an eternity, she shifted. Not much, but enough. Encouraged, Logan kept at it, nudging her, coaxing her, using every ounce of patience he had. She grumbled low in her throat, but finally, she dragged herself forward a few inches. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It took over an hour, but inch by inch, Logan got her moving. He had never worked so hard in his life, and by the time they reached the tree line near his cabin, he was shaking from exhaustion. She collapsed near the edge of his clearing, her massive body heaving with exertion. Logan stared down at her, chest rising and falling, his breath coming in heavy gasps. He had done it. She was here. Now he just had to figure out what the hell to do next. Snow drifted lazily from the darkened sky, each flake glistening in the weak moonlight as it settled over the clearing. Logan stood there, his breath coming in heavy clouds, staring down at the exhausted grizzly sprawled near the edge of his cabin's clearing. The wind had picked up again, rattling the branches of the towering pines around them, and he knew she wouldn't last the night out here. He had managed to get her this far, but now came the real challenge. How the hell was he supposed to convince a half-conscious, starving, pregnant bear to take shelter? His body ached from exertion, his muscles burning with each breath, but he pushed the fatigue aside. He had done crazier things in his life. Maybe not smarter things, but crazier. That had to count for something. He took a cautious step closer, testing her reaction. Sage, as he had started calling her in his head, barely stirred, her massive body rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. The snow had already begun to gather along her back, melting in some places where her warmth still lingered, but frosting over in others. Her fur was coarse, tangled with debris, and he could see fresh scrapes along her legs where she had stumbled through the ice and jagged rocks. She had fought to get here, but her fight was running out. Logan exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. He had two choices. He could leave her here and hope she survived the night, or he could do something incredibly reckless and try to get her inside. And of course, the reckless option was the one his gut told him to take. The cabin wasn't big, a single-room structure built with his own hands, just enough to keep the elements at bay. It wasn't meant for guests, much less a grizzly, but it was all he had. The shed behind it might work, but it wasn't insulated, and with the storm rolling in, she wouldn't last long out there either. He blew out a breath, muttering under his breath about the sheer insanity of what he was about to do. Moving with slow, deliberate steps, he closed the last few feet between them, crouching beside her. She barely reacted, her breathing slow but steady. He reached out, hesitated, then let his fingers brush against the thick fur of her shoulder. She didn't flinch. That, more than anything, told him just how far gone she was. "All right, girl," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You got this far. Just a little further." He shifted his grip, pressing his hands against her side, trying to coax her up. Nothing. He gritted his teeth and tried again, putting more force behind it. This time she groaned low in her throat, shifting slightly, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Logan cursed under his breath. She was too weak. He needed another plan. He pushed to his feet, his mind racing through his limited options. If he couldn't get her to move on her own, he'd have to make a sled of some kind. But dragging a bear, even a weakened one, would be damn near impossible. Then an idea, his old tarp. It was thick, sturdy enough to carry firewood when he needed it, and large enough that if he could just roll her onto it, he might be able to pull her the rest of the way. It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than nothing. He jogged toward the cabin, his boots crunching through the snow as he yanked open the storage chest near the porch. He dug through supplies until his fingers found the rough fabric of the tarp. He hauled it out, shaking off the snow that had settled on top. As he turned back towards Sage, he caught sight of the distant ridgeline, the way the wind had begun whipping the snow into a blinding haze. The storm was closing in. He didn't have much time. Rushing back, he spread the tarp beside her, then crouched and braced himself. "This is probably the dumbest thing I've ever done," he muttered before gripping her front legs and pulling. She didn't resist, but she was heavy, dead weight against the frozen ground. Logan gritted his teeth, planting his feet and heaving with everything he had. Inch by inch, he managed to shift her onto the tarp, his arms burning from the effort. When she was finally settled, he straightened, rolling his shoulders. This was the hard part. He wrapped the ends of the tarp around his hands, testing the weight. It was going to be brutal. He dug his boots into the snow, bent his knees and pulled. At first, nothing happened. His back screamed in protest, his fingers tightening around the fabric. He adjusted his grip and pulled again, this time managing to get just enough momentum to shift her forward. He took a step, then another, dragging her slowly toward the cabin. The effort sent fire through his muscles, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Each step was agony, but he focused on the goal. The warmth of the cabin, the safety it offered. The wind howled around him, the snow thickening, but he kept going. When he finally reached the porch, he nearly collapsed from the sheer effort. Sage lay still, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. Now came the trickiest part, getting her inside. The door was just wide enough if he maneuvered her right. He took a moment to catch his breath, then adjusted his grip and pulled her over the threshold. The warmth of the cabin hit him instantly, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. He kept pulling until she was fully inside, then let the tarp fall from his hands as he stumbled back, panting. He had done it. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring down at her. The fire crackled in the hearth, the light casting flickering shadows over the wooden walls. He could see the slow rise and fall of her chest, the way her sides expanded and contracted with each breath. She was safe, at least for now. Logan moved quickly, grabbing blankets from the cot, piling them near the fire before rolling her off the tarp and onto them. She let out a weak huff but didn't protest. He knelt beside her, reaching for his canteen. Uncapping it, he poured a little water into his palm and held it near her muzzle. She hesitated before lapping at it, her tongue rough against his skin. "Good girl," he murmured, watching as she took another sip. He had no idea what the hell he was doing. No clue if she'd make it through the night, or if he'd just brought something into his home that could kill him the moment she regained her strength. But as he sat back against the wall, exhaustion settling deep into his bones, he realized something strange. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp fur. the heat from the fire pressing against the chill still lingering in the air. Logan sat on the floor, his back resting against the rough wood of the wall, watching the grizzly's slow, steady breathing. She hadn't moved much since he'd dragged her inside, aside from the occasional shift of her massive paws or the flick of an ear. He had no idea if she was improving or just clinging to the last threads of life. But she was here, out of the storm, and that was all he could do for now. His body ached from the effort of hauling her across the frozen ground, every muscle in his arms and back protesting as he stretched his legs out in front of him. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He'd spent years making sure he didn't have to care for anything again. Years convincing himself that solitude was a choice, not a consequence. But now here he was, holed up in a one-room cabin with a half-dead pregnant grizzly sprawled out on his floor like she belonged there. Maybe he was losing his mind. He scrubbed a hand down his face, his fingers lingering at the thick growth of his beard. The storm outside was relentless, snow hammering against the roof, the wind wailing through the trees. If she'd stayed out there, she wouldn't have lasted until morning. Hell, he wasn't sure she'd last even in here, but at least she had a chance now. He shifted forward, grabbing the canteen again, pouring another small pool of water into his palm. This time, Sage didn't hesitate as much, her large tongue rasping against his skin as she drank. He could feel the strength in her even now. Weak as she was, there was fight in her still. That was good. She needed to fight. He needed her to fight, because he sure as hell hadn't dragged her all the way here just to watch her fade away. Once she finished drinking, he sat back again, his gaze roaming over her. She was a mess, her fur matted with snow, twigs, and patches of dried blood from old wounds. He'd seen plenty of injured animals in his time, knew the signs of one too far gone, and while she was in rough shape, she wasn't past saving. The real question was whether she'd let herself be saved. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. What the hell was he supposed to do with a grizzly bear? He had no medical supplies fit for treating an animal this size, no knowledge of what she needed beyond food, water, and warmth. If she had internal injuries, there was nothing he could do, but she was still breathing. That was enough for now. He pushed himself to his feet, his knees popping in protest. The cabin was warm, but he knew the fire would need more wood soon. He moved quietly, not wanting to startle her, though she barely acknowledged his presence. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside into the howling wind. Snow had already piled high against the porch, swirling in angry gusts that stung his face. He cursed under his breath, shoving forward toward the small shed where he kept his firewood. The storm was getting worse. He grabbed an armful of logs, hauling them back inside, shutting the door against the fury of the blizzard. The warmth inside hit him immediately, and he let out a breath, shaking the snow from his coat before stacking the wood near the fireplace. Sage didn't move, but he caught the slow flicker of her eyelids, the brief glint of dark eyes watching him. He tossed another log onto the fire, the flames surging higher, licking against the stone hearth. The cabin filled with the rich scent of burning pine. He turned back to her, crouching near her head, noting the way her breath came a little easier now. "You're gonna be all right," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. He stayed up for hours, feeding the fire, watching over her, listening to the storm rage outside. His mind drifted, memories creeping in like shadows against the walls. He thought of Sarah, her laughter, the way she used to tease him about his stubbornness, how she had always been the one who made him feel whole. He thought of the accident, the way the world had shattered in an instant, leaving him with nothing but the unbearable weight of grief. He had come here to escape, to disappear into the wilderness, where nothing could hurt him anymore. But now here was this bear, dragging him right back into the mess of caring, of hoping, of risking loss all over again. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chest as if he could press down the ache that never fully left him. He didn't know why he had done this, why he had gone out into the storm and dragged her here, why he was sitting on the floor beside her instead of pretending she wasn't his problem. Maybe because she was alone, like he was. Maybe because she was fighting to survive, the way he had been, even when he hadn't been sure if he wanted to. He glanced over at her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, the way her massive paws twitched slightly in sleep. She had trusted him in whatever way a wild animal could. That meant something. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he let himself doze off, his head resting against the wall, the warmth of the fire lulling him into restless sleep. When he woke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The storm had passed. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint sound of snow settling against the trees. The second thing he noticed was that Sage was watching him. He blinked, his body stiff from sleeping in such an awkward position, but he didn't move right away. Her dark eyes were locked onto him, her head slightly raised now, her breathing stronger. He could feel the shift in the air between them, something unspoken passing in that space. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew without a doubt that this wasn't over. She wasn't just another wild animal passing through. She was here in his cabin, alive because he had pulled her from the cold. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, that meant something. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, stretching out the stiffness in his limbs. Sage didn't move, just tracked his movements with careful eyes. He grabbed another piece of meat from his supplies and tossed it toward her. She hesitated for only a moment before snapping it up, chewing slowly. He nodded to himself, satisfied. She was eating. That was a good sign. He wasn't sure what came next, if she would leave when she was strong enough, or if she would linger, if he even wanted her to go. But for now, she was here, and for the first time in a long time, Logan wasn't alone. The morning light filtered through the frost-lined window, casting a pale golden glow inside the cabin. The fire had burned low, the embers pulsing weakly, but the warmth still lingered, keeping the cold at bay. Logan sat up slowly, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders, his muscles still aching from the night before. His first thought was of the storm, but as he glanced toward the door, he saw that the world outside had settled into an eerie, frozen silence. The snow was piled thick against the porch, smooth and undisturbed. The trees bowed beneath its weight. His second thought was of Sage. He turned toward her, half expecting to see the same motionless figure from the night before. But this time, something was different. She was awake, her dark eyes locked onto him, her body no longer completely limp against the floor. She had shifted, if only slightly, her front paws stretched out before her head no longer resting against the blankets, but raised just enough to watch him with quiet awareness. Logan met her gaze, neither of them moving, the space between them charged with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hostility. It was something quieter, something like understanding. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, then pushed himself to his feet, feeling the familiar pop in his knees as he stretched. She didn't flinch at the movement, just followed him with her tired, knowing eyes. That was good. It meant she wasn't on the brink of death anymore. He stepped toward the fire, adding another log, stoking the embers back to life until flames licked hungrily at the fresh wood, crackling and spitting tiny sparks into the air. The heat expanded, pushing back the last of the night's cold, and he turned back to Sage, watching as she let out a slow, rumbling breath, her body visibly relaxing into the warmth. "Yeah," he murmured, mostly to himself. "I know the feeling." She still looked rough. Her fur, though thick, was tangled and matted with bits of ice and dirt, her frame too thin for a creature that should have been storing fat for winter. He wasn't sure how long she'd been struggling before he found her, but she had clearly been starving, likely for weeks. The food he had given her the night before had been just enough to keep her going, but it wouldn't be enough to get her strength back. He needed to get her more. Logan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had a small supply of meat, enough for himself for a few weeks, but that would barely sustain a bear. He would need to hunt, maybe set some traps. That meant heading out into the woods, leaving her here alone. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. If she woke up stronger and decided to lash out, his cabin wouldn't stand a chance. But if she was well enough to get up, she'd also be well enough to leave, and somehow, that thought didn't sit right with him either. He let out another breath and shook his head. "Damn bear," he muttered under his breath, but there was no heat in the words. After throwing on his coat and boots, he grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, the cold biting at his face immediately. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind of crispness that only came after a hard snowfall. The world was eerily still, the forest draped in white, muffling every sound. He could see the tracks from where he had dragged Sage the night before, already partially covered by fresh snow. If anyone had come looking for her, other animals, scavengers, they hadn't made it through the storm. He moved quickly, knowing he couldn't stay out long. He made his way down toward the creek, where he had seen deer tracks a few days prior, his boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. The forest was familiar, the silence comforting in a way only solitude could be. He had lived out here long enough to know its rhythms, its language. He could feel when the land was restless, when a predator lurked nearby, when the air carried something unnatural. Today it was just quiet. He tracked a small herd of deer for nearly an hour before he spotted his chance. A young buck, not the largest, but healthy enough to provide enough meat for both him and Sage. He steadied his breath, aimed, and fired. The shot echoed through the trees, shattering the stillness, and the buck fell instantly. Logan moved fast, his hands quick and practiced as he worked to field dress the animal, cutting away what he didn't need, bundling the best portions of meat into his pack. Blood stained the snow, the sharp scent thick in the air, but he worked efficiently, mindful of the cold seeping into his fingers. He would come back for the rest later, but for now this would do. By the time he made it back to the cabin, his breath was coming in heavy puffs, his arms straining under the weight of the fresh meat. He stomped the snow from his boots, pushed the door open, and was immediately met with a pair of dark eyes watching him from across the room. Sage hadn't moved much, but her ears perked at the scent of blood, her nostrils flaring slightly. He saw something flicker in her expression. Awareness, hunger, the remnants of instinct pushing through her exhaustion. Yeah, I got you," Logan muttered, setting the pack down and pulling out a chunk of meat. He cut it into more manageable pieces, tossing one toward her. It landed near her paws, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She snapped it up, chewing slowly, carefully, like she was savoring every bite. He watched her for a moment, then cut another piece, setting it closer. She ate that too. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest as he studied her. There was no doubt about it. She was recovering. Slowly maybe, but she was fighting her way back. He should have felt relieved, maybe even satisfied. Instead, he felt something else creeping in, something heavier, attachment. He wasn't sure when it had started, but it was there now, pressing at the edges of his chest, making him uneasy. He had told himself he wasn't going to care, that this was just survival, just a matter of circumstance. But looking at her now, her body still weak but stronger than before, he knew it was a lie. He cared. He shook his head and turned away, busying himself with cleaning the rest of the meat, storing what he could, cooking some for himself. The cabin was quiet again, save for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of Sage shifting against the blankets. Outside, the sun had begun to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. Another day gone, another day she had survived. As he sat down near the fire with his own meal, he glanced at her again. She was watching him still, her breathing steady, her eyes unreadable. He wasn't sure what would happen when she was strong enough to leave, if she would just disappear into the wild as if none of this had ever happened. But for now she was here, and for now that was enough. He sighed, picking at his food, his mind wandering despite himself. He had spent so long avoiding connections, avoiding responsibility beyond his own existence. But now, with a half-healed bear stretched out on his floor, he was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The snow had started to melt just a little, just enough that the edges of Logan's roof dripped in slow, rhythmic patterns, the ice easing its grip on the land. The air still held the bite of winter, but there was a shift now, something softer beneath the cold, a whisper of spring waiting beneath the frozen earth. Logan stood outside his cabin, arms crossed over his chest, watching the tree line, listening to the stillness. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he had dragged Sage inside, half frozen, barely clinging to life, and now she was strong enough to stand, to move, to leave. He should have been relieved, should have been grateful she had made it through, that nature hadn't claimed her the way it had so many others. But as he turned back toward the cabin, as he saw her standing in the open doorway, Watching him, something inside him twisted in a way he hadn't expected. She was different now. The hollowness in her ribs had begun to fill, her coat had lost some of its dullness, and her dark eyes were no longer clouded with exhaustion. She was still thin, still recovering, but she wasn't the desperate creature he had found on the ridge anymore. She was something else now, something stronger, and yet she lingered. He had expected her to leave the moment she could, to disappear into the woods as soon as her body allowed, but she hadn't. Not yet. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, watching as she stepped forward, her massive paws pressing into the wet snow, leaving deep impressions in the slush. She moved cautiously, not out of fear, but consideration, as if testing her own strength, as if feeling the weight of her body beneath her, for the first time in weeks. Logan didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as she made her way toward the trees, slow, deliberate, and then she stopped. Paused at the edge of the clearing, her head lifting slightly as she sniffed the air. She hesitated. Logan's hands curled into fists at his sides, an unfamiliar tension settling in his chest. He had prepared himself for this, had told himself over and over again that this was what was supposed to happen. She was wild. She didn't belong here, in his cabin, in his life. But then she turned her head just slightly, just enough to glance back at him over her shoulder. And for a moment, just a moment, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been thinking the same thing. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay rooted to the spot, to let her make the choice, to not interfere with the thing he had spent so long telling himself was inevitable. But she didn't move, didn't disappear into the trees the way he had expected. Instead, she stood there, watching him, the same way she had that first night, when she had been too weak to lift her head. Only now she wasn't weak. She was deciding. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, the kind of silence that felt like it held weight, like it carried something unspoken. And then, as if coming to some quiet conclusion, she took another step forward, not into the woods, not away from him, but toward him. It was slow, hesitant, but deliberate. Logan felt his breath catch, though he didn't know why. She was close now. Close enough that he could see the way the wind ruffled her fur. Close enough that he could hear the low, steady sound of her breathing. She lowered her head slightly, exhaling a deep, rumbling breath. And then, before he could even think, she nudged his arm. It was soft, almost tentative, but it sent a shock through him, his muscles locking in place as he stared down at her, at the massive creature pressing her nose gently against his sleeve. He had spent years pushing everything away, pushing people away, pushing himself into the silence of these mountains, so he wouldn't have to feel, so he wouldn't have to remember. But now standing here, with this wild thing choosing to stay, he realized something terrifying. He didn't want her to leave. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He had spent so much time trying to convince himself that he was fine alone, that he needed the quiet, that he wanted the solitude. But now, after weeks of tending to her, of watching over her, of feeling her presence in the cabin, he knew the truth. He wasn't fine. He never had been. Sage pulled back slightly, watching him, waiting. Logan exhaled sharply and shook his head, a rough, humorless chuckle slipping past his lips. "You're something else," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. She huffed softly, a deep, almost amused sound, and he swore, for the briefest second, that she understood him. He didn't know what this meant, didn't know if she would stay forever, if she would leave tomorrow, if she would disappear into the wild as suddenly as she had entered his life. But for now she was here, and for the first time in a long, long time, Logan Wells wasn't afraid of what came next. As the sun rose higher, melting more of the snow, Logan turned toward the cabin, glancing back at Sage, who stood beside him, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. He didn't say anything else, didn't try to name whatever had formed between them in the weeks they had spent surviving together. He just opened the door, stepped inside, and left it open behind him. Sage hesitated for only a moment before following. Some connections in life come unexpectedly, forging bonds we never knew we needed. This story reminds us that even in the harshest conditions, survival is not just about strength, it's about trust, compassion, and the willingness to fight for something beyond ourselves. Logan believed he was destined for solitude, but in saving the bear, he also saved himself. Sometimes the most unlikely encounters lead us back to the parts of ourselves we thought were lost. It's a powerful reminder that kindness, even when given to the wild and untamed, has the ability to change lives. Whether human or animal, we all seek warmth, understanding, in a place where we belong. Logan and the bear's journey teaches us that healing isn't always about forgetting the past. It's about finding the courage to embrace what comes next. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of survival and connection. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and inspiring tales. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that touch the soul. Stay tuned for more, and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when we least expect them.